המערכה הגדולה מזרחה, בחזיתה מזרחה, וראשי הגזרים היו נוגעים בתפוח. So he set up the large fire in the east, and its appearance, or the way you would see it in its opening, would be from the east. In the heads of the logs, the tips of the logs on the inside would touch the tapuach, and then there was space between the logs that inside there, that's where they would light the kindling. So I showed you a picture. Right, so this would be here. This would be the Maracha Gedolah. It doesn't show that the logs would be sticking out, touching the tapuach inside. And now we get choose from there. In other words, from where? Where would they be choosing from to take nice fig wood? Where are we talking
about? The storeroom for where they keep the wood.
Well, you might think that, but what was the last thing that we were reading about in Mishnah Daled? We're talking about the marachot, right? We're talking mainly about the maracha gedolah, right? As we just saw in the illustration. So they would choose from, and that's what the Bartanur says, mi bein mekom ha'itzim, amongst the place where the eitzim, they would choose from there. So the truth is, Michael, you know what? It could be that you're right that they meant it, but I understood it to mean that they would take from the marach, from the one maracha, they would take some of the wood, the sader hamaracha shalektoret, and they would use that.
So they're taking wood that's already on the mizbeach.
That's what I think. That okay. I think. Mibein mekom ha'itzim. Because otherwise I think it would have said they would have taken from Lishkat Ha'itzim, and that's an actual place in the Beit HaMikdash.
And so we're repeating the word misham.
Yeah, so, or what?
So you would think it was.
Uh-oh, I lost your I lost your voice there. Uh-oh. Wait, can anybody hear me?
Yeah, I hear
we hear you. Yes.
Oh, okay. No, so I lost Shuli, but yeah, the Misham seems to refer to whatever we were talking about earlier.
She probably means that the Misham is repeated. Yes, it's the last word of Mishnah Dalet, and then again, Beru Misham. So it should be the same Sham.
Right. Exactly. So that's why I assumed that the Sham is mi bein mekom ha'itzim that the Bartanur is talking about is from place. So there would be two new logs that would be put on, but of course that wasn't the only wood that was there, and they kept this. The fire would be attended to every morning. This is what we're talking about. So they would take from the Atzeitei Nayafin. We mentioned earlier in the Mishnah that even though any kind of wood, except for certain exceptions, right? Kol ha'itzim ksherim l'maracha, chutz mishel zayit v'shel gefen, aval be'elu regilin. They used to take, normally they would take more biyot shel te'ena. They would take branches from the fig tree. and also Shalagos, Shalatz Shemen. But we see from this Mishnah that Stam, they would have Atzei Ta'ina, and they would use it to set up the second Maracha, which is for the Ktoret. And that Maracha was Mikeneged Keren Ma'aravit Dromit. It was next to the southwest corner. Mashuch Mina Keren Kapei Tzafon Arba Amot. And it was pulled northward from the corner by 4 amot, right? So that's in the picture. That's why this is placed here. This is the Maracha for Torah. This is the southwest here, and so I don't, they have a scale here, and I guess it's roughly accurate. So this is about 4 amot up from northward from that corner. So this is the Maracha for the Ktoret. The Omed Chamesh Sa'im Gechalim. It was estimated at about 5 sa'ah of coals. A sa'ah, for our purposes, is about 7.5 liters. About, what would that be? 7.5 liters. You can assume the relative size. Uve Shabbat, ba'omed shmonat se'im gechalim. And on Shabbat, they would make that maracha larger. It would be about 8 sa'ah of coals. Because that's where they would put 2 censers of frankincense used for the lechem hapanim. And we will talk about that later, exactly what that was and how that avodah went. Ha'evarim v'ha'pedarim, the limbs and the fats, shaloni taklumi ba'erev, that had not been consumed from them before. Machzirin otan l'ma'aracha, we put them back. They would put them back onto the fire. The first ma'aracha that we talked about, hitzitu shtei hachot be'esh, and then they would light of the marachot with fire. V'yardu ba'u lahem lishkat gazit, and then they would go down. In other words, they would come down from the mizbech, and then they would go to the lishkat gazit. So let's just see the Bartanura. Beiru misham mibein makom ha'itzim ba'omed chamesh sa'im hayatam maracha shel ktoret. Right? So there was about 5 sa'ah in that fire that was used for the Ktoret. Kamoch sa'im gechalim, about 5 sa'ah worth, size-wise of coals. Shemehem yachoteh l'tzorech ha'ktoret. So what does it mean it was used for the Ktoret? That's where they would take coals from that mara to go inside the Beit HaMikdash to light the inside Mizbeach, where they would burn the Ktoret. And Ba'omed with an Ayin, Bartanura is like Ba'omed with an Aleph, right? So it's an approximation. Shabbat, Ba'omed Shmonat Sa'im. On Shabbat, it had approximately 8 Sa'im. Lefish Tzarich Gechalim, Lishnei B'zichei Levona Shel Lechem HaPanim, Hayu Maktirim Mishabbat L'Shabbat. Because on Shabbat, they would need more coals. It wasn't enough just to bring the coals for lighting the Mizbeach HaPnimi for the Ktoret. They also had to have coals to burn the B'zichei Levona, the frankincense censers that went along with the shewbread, the panim, that would be burned, right? Would be lit from one Shabbat to another Shabbat. So the limb fats that hadn't been consumed from the night before, they would be put back on the maracha, v'nisrafim sham b'tzidei ha'maracha gdola. And they would get burnt on the sides of the large maracha. And then they would go down to Lishkat HaGazit to do the paisot. So what we've done so far is from the earliest time that we're talking about, we have like the early things that happened in the Beit HaMikdash, how the Memuneh would come into place where people were sleeping in Beit HaMoked, then they would go out, they would split into two groups, and one would go west and one would go east, and they would go all the way around inside of the Beit HaMikdash and meet up at Mishkat HaChavitin. They would meet up at the place where they would make the Chavitin for the Kohen Gadol. And then one of them, whoever was going to do Trumat, he would go off by himself up to the Mizbeach and do the Trumat HaDeshen. And then that's where that's a summary of the first chapter, right? And then after that, we begin the second chapter. Then his brethren would see that he came. They would go and wash up, and they would go onto the top of the Mizbeach. And here also, first, Ha'ivarim v'Apadarim shelo nitaklum erev somkinatam mitzadei HaMizbeach. So just to remind us early on, first they would take anything that hadn't been consumed from the night before and they would come onto the side of the Mizbeach. In other words, not on the fire. And if there wasn't enough room there, they would put them down on the kavesh at the point where it met the sovev. Remember, the sovev is this part of the Mizbeach that sticks out halfway up. Right, we don't have to go through the whole thing, but then they would set up the maracha. Once the marachot were set up, then they would take those evarim u'pdarim and put them back on the fire to continue burning. So let's go now to that's the wrong one. That's Yoma. I brought that up because I wanted to remind us. Yeah, here we are. Okay. I wanted to remind us that what we're about to learn now, this Mishnah, we also learned the first two Mishnayot here in the third chapter of Tamid are the same as what we learned back in the third chapter of Yoma. And just to remind us, and we're going to go through them again anyway. And hold on, I also wanted to go back a second to the map. I'm still unsure about the sharing thing, so I keep checking to make sure that you can see the right screen. So here in the Rambam's, this is based on the Rambam's picture, or one of the Rambam's pictures. I'll show you another one later. That's one of the bases for this one. And so this, most of this is an overhead view, but this part here is the Mizbeach. It's given in a side view. So then after they would do all of these things on the Mizbeach, and they would line up, do the marachot and put on the evarim u'ptarim, they would go down, and then they would go over here to and that's where they would do the paisot. Okay. So Amar Lahem HaMimuneh. So now Muneh tells them Bo v'hafisu. Come in and do the paisot. Right, so they do this pais. Now, mi shochet, mi zoreh, mi midashen mizbeach hapnimi, mi midashen et hamnorah, mi malei evarim bakevesh, harosh v'haregel u'shtei hayadayim, ha'oketz v'haregel, ha'chazeh v'hagera u'shtei defanot, ha'kravayim, ha'solet v'hachabitim v'hayayin, hefisu zacha mi shezacha. Right. So this was the same Mishnah that we saw in the beginning of Perek Shlishi and Yoma. And here, as it were, this is this is its rightful place because here in Tamid, we're talking about the things that were done every day. And of course, on Yom Kippurim, some of these things, there wasn't a pie, right? Because the Kohen Gadol had to do the avodot. So here we'll just to remind us, we're going to go through the Bar Tanura, what all of this is about. So these are all the avodot that are now in this payis. Who's going to slaughter and who's going to spill the blood on the mizbeach? Remove the ashes from the that's inside. There's the golden Beach that was used for the Ketoret. See the Bar Tanura on some of this. Mishochet, afal gav the shchita kshera bezar. Even though shchita was kosher by a non-kohen, zar here meaning a non-kohen, tiknu ba'payis. Nonetheless, they made a payis for it. Ditavodat tamidhi v'chaviva lahu, because it was the beginning of the avodah of the korban tamid per se. And they liked to do it. It was something that people wanted to do. Right? And if you have this lottery system, then people would come to argue about it, and then they might come to some kind of danger, as we saw when we learned that back in Yoma. Mizorek. So who's going to throw the blood onto the mizbeach? The Bar Tanura explains, Mikal Hadam hu azorek. So in other words, at the time of the slaughtering, there would be somebody who slaughtered, and right next to them would be another Kohen who was going to take a kli to capture the blood as it was coming out of the slaughtered animal. So the person who's Mikabel Hadam, he's the one who's going to throw it on the mizbeach. Mishum kara korban havyazrika lahachi nakatla. Since the main korban, mishum teikar korban havyazrika, the main korban, in other words, the main offering was throwing the blood on the mizbeach. That's why they mention zrika. In other words, what question is the Bar Tanura trying to answer here? Explains that the zorek is the same person who captured the blood. What is he trying to explain?
The Zorik, it's like a two-step process. First, you have to collect the blood, and then sprinkle it. And it's really, from what he says, it's the sprinkling that's the main part of the offering of the korban.
Right, exactly. And in fact, and if you learn earlier in Mishnayot, like in Masechet Zvachim, you understand that there's somebody there who has to actually capture the blood. So he's trying to answer the question: why isn't that there a payis for the mikabel? why didn't they choose the person who's going to be Mikabel? So he says, in fact, they are choosing him but they call him here in the Mishnah the Zorek because it's the same person. So that's the main thing he wanted to clarify. Mi midashem is mizbeach hapnimi. Here also, right, it doesn't say who burns the Ktoret, but it turns out that the person who removes the deshen from the internal Mizbeach, he's the one who is going to also offer the Ktoret. Mishum de dishun tchilat avodah shel Ktoreti nakatla. Since the dishun is the beginning of the avodah of the Ktoret, in other words, of off-burning the Ktoret, that's why taken. In other words, that's why the language of midashen is mentioned and not the mirror, because again, it's the same person. V'chein dishun hamenorah tchilat hadlaka. Right? Before you can light the menorah, you have to first clean out the ash from whatever was burnt from before that's in the menorah. Dishun mizbeach hapnimi v'menorah kodem shchitat tamid hayim. Those two actions of dishun mizbeach and dishun mizbeach hapnimi, right, removing the ash from the Mizbeach HaZahav and cleaning out the menorah, and then bringing the Ketaret and lighting the menorah, that took place before the Shrita of the Tamid. Hadamid kar b'seder hapayis shoch v'zorek b'reisha mishum she'en ikar avodat fein. So if that's, in other words, if it's true that the dishun mizbeach hapnimi and the dishun hamnorah actually precedes the shchita and the zrika of the korban tamid, why were they mentioned second, right? Mishum v'hadamid ka b'seir hapayis shochet v'zorek b'reisha. So shochet and zorek are mentioned earlier, even though they're done later. That's the main avodah. That was considered to be the central part of the avodah, was to do the shchita of the tamid and to sprinkle the blood on the mizbeach. Right, and so then it lists the parts of the animal that were brought up, and one of them is the oketz. The oketz is the aliyah. The aliyah is the fatty tail of the sheep. Echazeh, the chest, is kol hashuman haro'et karka. It's all the fat that sees the ground, right? And it's the frontal part of the sheep. V'hagera, makom ma'ale gera, the place where he brings up his cud. Hu hatzavar, that's the neck. Uvo mechubarim kenei hareya. That's where the pipe of the lungs is connected to the liver and the heart. I think I showed you some of the pictures before. I'm not going to bring them up again because I didn't prepare them this time. Right, and then
Shel. Yeah. Yeah,
yes.
the Mishnah says, Mi shochet, mi zorek, mi medashem, as if these were three different people. And Bartonura explains that they are the same. I don't understand what's going on.
No. The shochet and the zorek and the medashem, they were all three different people. But shochet, the zorek, did two things. He was mikal the dam, ukiber the dam bekli, and the midashen mizbeach hapnimi and the midashen hamnorah, respectively. Also, the person who cleaned the mizbeach hapnimi also lit the ketoret, and the person who cleaned the menorah also lit the menorah. But the shochet was one person. And the zorek, right? The zorek. So that these were not all people, right? They were three. These were three, in fact, right? Four different people. Shochet, Zorek, Midashen Mizbeach HaPnimi, Midashen Et HaMenorah. There were four different people, but these three all had two things to do. Does that clarify?
Okay.
Mm-hmm. All right, so they would do the whoever won, right? Whoever pointed to the various tasks, they're the ones who did the task. So the Bartun explains, whoever got the payis for sprinkling the blood, and the one next to him did the shchita, right? And we mentioned this last time, right? That the first person to win the payis was the zoreket adam, and then the person next to him would do the shchita. The afa pisha shchita kodemet lekabbalah, even though again chronologically you have to do shchita before you capture the blood. Mikol makom mibnei shavodat azrika min hashchita shashchita kshera v'zar ma she'inkin b'zrika yichach zacha harishon she'giya lo hapayis b'zrika. Right, but since the zrika, the act of doing the zrika was considered to be greater than shchita, because shchita could be done by a non-kohen, and even though they did in practice do it, it was considered to be a lesser avodah. So therefore the first one to be chosen he got the most important job. And the most important job was to sprinkle the blood on the yoke. V'asheni asamuch lo b'shchita, v'ashlishi midashen mizbeach hapnimi u'maktir haktoret. Right, as he mentioned before, then the third person is going to clean off the mizbeach and offer the ktoret. The fourth one is going to clean the menorah and light the candles of the menorah, madliket hanerot. The fifth one will bring up the head and the leg onto the kevesh, onto the ram. The sixth one is going to bring the two arms, and it's the two front legs. The seventh one, ha'oketz, dainu ha'aliyah v'haregel. The seventh one will bring the fatty tail and the other left leg. Hashmini ha'chazer. The eighth one is going to bring the chest, which we said is the fat from the front of the animal, and the geirah, the area of neck. Vatshi'i shtei tfanot. The ninth one is going to bring the two flanks. Vasiri hakravayim. The 10th one is going to bring the innards. V'achadasar hasolat shel milchat nisim. Shihi kreva im hatamid. It's going to bring up the fine flour that was for the milchat nisachim, the korban milchat that's brought with the libations, that was brought with the korban tamid. The 12th one is going to bring chavitei kohen gadol, right, which we described in an earlier shiur. V'shosha sar yayin shel nisachim. And then the 13th one is going to bring up the wine that will be used for the libations. Kol elu shosha asar kohanim yotzim b'vayis echad k'meforash b'perek sheni d'Yoma. Right, so all of these, we take all of these 13 kohanim in one payis. It's done. Whoever the number fell out on, he would do the zrika, and then they would go around next to him. Then the guy after him would do shchit. For him would do the dishun hamizbeach hapnimi, and then the dishun hamizbeach hamenorah, and so forth. Okay, let's go on to the next Mishnah. Amar lehem hamimunes in our Mishnah Bet. We also saw this Mishnah in Yoma. So the Mimuneh now says to them, okay, So now all the players are in place, right, for the next avodot, the next services that have to be done. We know who all the players are. So now he says, go out and see if the time for Shlita has come. So the time for slaughtering has to be during the day, right? We talked last time that Dishun HaMizbeach, Shumat HaDeshin per se, that could be at night. And it was they started somewhere around dawn, except on Regalim, which would be much earlier, and Kippur would all be earlier. But in principle, that could be earlier. But the Shchita, the Etakeves Achat said Baboker, it has to be Baboker properly. So he tells them, go up and see if the time for slaughtering the Korban Tamid has come. Im Higia, so somebody then would go up, right? The Bartinu will say, Al Makom Gavo Shayal Lahem B'Mikdash. So go up onto this place that they had in the Mikdash to look out on the horizon to see if you can see the dawn. Im Higia, so if the time had come, Haroeh Omer Barkai, the person who sees it calls out Barkai, like it's shining, right? It's like lightning, right? It's I see the light. Matya ben Shmuel now this part here, I mentioned when we learned it before, there are a couple of ways of learning these lines, and we'll look at that separately. I sent you a separate sheet for that. We'll take a look at that in a moment. Matya ben Shmuel Omer He'ir Pnei Kol HaMizrach Ad Shehu B'Chevron V'hu Omer Hein. So one of the things that we see right away that makes this difficult to read. Now I put punctuation here. And the punctuation I put is in accordance to the way the Bartanura reads it, which is one of the pshatim in the Gemara. But if you take away the punctuation, this whole keta here is a bit awkward because in the Tanakama says like this, that the Memuneh speaks. He says, "Tzuru im higia zman hashchita, im higia haroeh omer." The person who sees it, he says, "Barkai." Matya ben Shmuel omer, and then he doesn't say who says what. Right here it says haroeh omer, and here it doesn't say haroeh omer. So there are different possibilities about who's saying what. So if we go along the lines of the Tanakama, then I could read it like this: Shmuel Omer, that the person who saw said, He'ir kol penei hamizrach ad shu bechevron, and leave off the question mark. That's what he would say. But then we are left with the question, V'hu omer hein, so who's the person who says hein? Who are they saying hein to? Who are they saying yes to? So another possibility is to say Mati ben Shmuel said this. That Mati ben Shmuel was a person who was in the Beit HaMikdash, and this is what he said. He would himself say, He'ir pnei kol mizrach ad shu b'chevron, and then maybe the whole here is a question. In other words, he asked this as a question. And then, Hu omer hein, he says yes. Who would that be? Who would say yes to him?
The man on the roof. The man upon.
Man on the roof.
He's
the man who's on the high.
is answering to the question of.
Right, so that's another possibility. And we'll see there's another way of reading it as well. Let's first look at the Bartanura. So the Mimuna would say Tsura U Amakom Gabo Shayanda Mish. Here's Zman Shchita, right? If the time for slaughtering came, Shchita Psula Balayla. Shchita is pasul if it's done at night. As it says, Biyom Ziv Chachem, right? On the day of your slaughter, the day that you have to slaughter during the day. Barkai, He'ir Shachar, that the morning star has lit up and is shining. He'ir Pnei Kol HaMizrach. So Mati ben Shmuel says He'ir Pnei Kol HaMizrach. Lo hayo omer klum ad shehiru Pnei HaMizrach. In other words, he wouldn't say anything until the entire east, the entire eastern horizon had lit up. She'ein maspik nekuda bilvan. It's not enough if it just lit up by a little bit, right? By a dot. Halacha kamatya ben Shmuel. Halacha is like Matya ben Shmuel. So what's the machloket between the Tanakama and Matya ben Shmuel? What are they arguing about? According to the Tanakama, what does the Ro'eh have to see? And according to Mati ben Shmuel, what does the Ro'eh have to see?
The Ro'eh just has to see a little bit of light, but according to Matya ben Shmuel, he has to see much. It has to be more extensive, all the way to Hebron.
Right, so he has to see the entire east lit up, and in fact, he's going to have that he sees it until he could see light on Hebron. So that was their machloket about how much light it had to be, how much light they were seeing. Adshu b'Chevron. So now the Bartanura says how to read this part of the Mishnah. Otan ha'omdim lamata. Shoalim lo higia ha'or b'Chevron. So the way Mati ben Shmuel tells it, according to the Bartanura, the Pihanim who are on the ground, they're asking the person who's the lookout, who's on the high place in the Beit HaMikdash, higia ha'or b'Chevron, did the light get all the way to Chevron? So in other words, he's reading like this. The Ro says, He'ir Pnei Kol HaMizrach, and then they ask him, Ashuhu b'Chevron, did you see it? Did you see the entire east all the way to Chevron? V'hu Omer Hein, the person who sees it says, yes, it's that far. And why did they mention Chevron? Why is Chevron important? In order to recall the merit of the patriarchs who were buried in Hebron, that's why they say this. That's what the Yerushalmi mentions. So let's digress on this a little bit. I just thought this would be interesting for everybody to see the little sugya, in the Gemara about this. Right. This is the Gemara in Yoma, right? Because again, this Mishnah, we saw it in Masechet Yoma, and so it appeared. This sugya is there. Matya ben Shmuel Omer v'chulei v'luhen. So this is just the Gemara quoting the Mishnah. So the Gemara has this question also about how to read the Mishnah. Man amar hein, who's the one who said Hain, who's the one who said yes. Ilema hach dekai igra. If you say it's the person who's on the roof, right, in the higher place, I love this phrase, Lim v'hu mefasher. He's the one who dreams, and he's the one who resolves the dream, right? Who explains the dream. In other words, it sounds like he would be talking to himself. Like, why would he be talking to himself? Why would he ask himself a question and then answer it himself? Right? He's like the dreamer who says, "This is my dream. I don't know what it means," but then he says, "This is means." Right? So it's a great phrase. Ela hachdekai aara. Rather, it has to be who said hein, who said yes. It must be the person who's on the ground. Menayada, he know. In other words, it goes like this: that it says here, Kol Penei HaMizrach Ad Shebechevron. So if you say it's that the person who said hein is the guy who's on the roof, so he's talking to himself. So then you'll say that according to both of these readings, at this point, the Gemara understands the beginning of the Mishnah, the beginning of Shmuel's statement. It's a person making a declarative statement. It's not a question. This is the initial reading, right? Because again, they didn't have punctuation. So the Amoraim who are reading the Mishnah, they're trying to figure out exactly how to read it. So the default assumption is that these are declarative statements, that when he says, He'ir penei kol hamizrach ad shehu bechevron, that he's saying, it's a declarative statement, that the entire east is lit up until it's in Hebron. So then who's yes? So if it's the guy on the roofs, then he's talking to himself. If it's the guy on the ground, how would he know? Right? He's not in the observation point. So how would he know that that's true? So the Gemara gives two possible readings. Ibayit ema hachdek ara. So if you want, I'll say it is the person who's on the ground. And if you want, I'll say it's the person who's on the roof. So how does it work? Ibayit ema hachdek igra. If you want to say that it's the person who's on the roof who says hein. So this is how the Mishnah, Amar Ihu, that person who's on the roof, he makes a declarative statement. He'ir penei kol hamizrach. The entire east is lit up. V'amar le hachdekaya ara. And this one who's standing on the ground says to him, Ad shebechevron. Did you see it all the way until Hebron? And then the person who's on the roof, Amar le ihu hein. He says to him, yes. So that's the way to read it, so that the hein is said by the person who's on the roof. Or I could also read it, it's the person who's standing on the ground. How does that work? Again, we read the Mishnah, Amar Ihu, the person who's on the ground starts, and he says, He'ir penei kol hamizrach. Did the entire east light up? So in other words, somebody climbed up to the roof, and then somebody on the ground asks him, is it light in the east? And the person who's on top says, Ad shebechevron. He says, yeah, it's lit all the way up Hebron. And then the person on the ground says, hein. Yes. That, in other words, as a confirmation. So the way, as I mentioned, the way I did the punctuation in the Mishnah was like the first answer, because that's the answer that the Bartanur uses, right? But if I did it this way, the question mark would be on the first line, He'ir penei kol hamizrach, that's a question. And then the second part is a declarative statement. So it's a little confusing, but I thought it was interesting. Let's just look at Rashi. Right, Hu Chalim v'Hu Mefasher. Yehu Mefasher Poter HaChalom. He's the one who's going to resolve the dream. Klomar Hu Shoel Hu Meshiv. He's going to ask and he's going to answer, like he's just talking to himself. So we give two part answers, that the person who's on the ground says yes, or the person who's on the roof says yes. So in the first instance, Amar Ihu Zesh al Agag. The first one, the person who's on the Igra, on the Gag, on the roof, he's the one who says, Eir Pnei Kol HaMizrach, and V'amar Hachdekaya Ara, the person who says Ad Shebechevron. It's a question. And if you want, I'll say it's the person who's on the ground who says Hein. And how does Amar Hein, right? The person who's on the ground says yes. Ketzad, how does that work? Amar Hadekaya Ara, the person who's on the ground, he starts off the conversation and he says, to the entire Torah, which he asks is a question. The person who's on the roof says, Ad shebechevron he'ir. It lit up to Hebron. The person who's standing on the ground says, Hein, kachani shoel. Yes, that's what I was asking. Matzina b'Talmud Yerushalmi. So Rashi here brings the Yerushalmi that the Bartanura mentioned. Kedei lazkir zchut avod maskirin, to mention in order to reference the merit of the patriarchs. That's why they mention Hebron again later. Oh, no, yeah. Okay. So that was a bit of a digression, but I just thought it was interesting. So, okay, so now we're back in Mishnah Gimel. Amar lahem, Su'u vehaviu talem mishkat hatlaim. So he said to them, go out and bring a sheep from the place where we keep the sheep. So who said to whom? Who's talking?
The Memune, the administrator.
The Memune.
The Memune.
That's a good word. I like that word. Thank you. The administrator. That's what we need, right? It means the appointed one, but the administrator is, yeah, we're going to call him the administrator.
For the lots. For the lots.
What's that?
For the lots. The administrator for the lots, for the procedure of lots.
Well, he's the administrator for the lots, so he's not only the administrator, he's the general administrator, because he conducts the pais, but then he's the one who makes sure that everything gets done, right? So he administrates. It's very good. So he tells them to go and bring a sheep, lishkata tlaim. So what's this lishkata tlaim? Bartuner says, lishka shayu hatlaim shel tamidim sham. There was a lishka, there was like a compartment or a place in the Beit HaMikdash where they would keep the sheep that they would use for the korbanot tamid. So for this, I want to show you also in the picture, and we're gonna take a look at the Mishnah and Masechet Midot, but just sort of place it in your minds. This is again this is the Shiur based on the Rambam's duration. So it's right. This is the area of the Beit HaMikdash. And the Rambam has this whole area here, which is Beit HaMoked. He has being just outside of the Beit HaMikdash, but I'll show you that here, Shiur, according to the Tosot Yom Tov, this area here is the Beit HaMoked. This area here is the Gatatlaim. So just to give you a little more background about this, I didn't prepare this as a whole separate sheet, but I'll show you, can I see it? One second. Dun, dun, dun. Huh. Wait a second. Here we go. Okay. If you want, here, I'm just going to show you this on the screen. Okay, sorry. This is the first chapter of Masechet Midot. So I'm just going to go right to the Mishnah that describes this part of the Beit HaMikdash. It's Perek Aleph, Mishnah Vav. It says, Varba v'shakot hayu b'veitei. There were 4 lishkot in the Beit HaMoked. Kikitonot the traklin. They were like small rooms that would open up into the main hall, the main palace. Shtayim b'kodesh, u'shtayim b'chol. 2 of them were in the part of the Beit HaMikdash, they were geographically located on the grounds of the Beit HaMikdash that was Kodesh, and 2 of the Lishakot were outside of that. They were on a part of the grounds that was not Kodesh. Roshei Pispasim Mavdilin Ben Kodesh L'chol. And the ends, the Pispasim, I'll explain in a moment, they would divide or they would differentiate between the Kodesh and the Chol. The Pispasim were these things that came down from the beams in the middle of the Beit HaMoked, that the Rambam describes them as being kind of like something like a lattice that would come down, so that wherever you're standing, you know that if you're in the Kodesh part or if you're in the whole part. Mahayu mishamshot, and what did each of the lishkot serve? What purpose did they serve? So Ma'aravit Dromit, the southwestern lishka, hi haita lishkat la'e korban. That's the lishka we're talking about. That's the lishka, the one that was in the southeast, that would be used to house the sheep that were used for the korban tamid. And then Dromit Mizrachit, the southeast one, what did I say? That was the southwest one, right? This is the southeast one. Hi haita lishkat osei lechem hapanim. That was the lishka where the people who made the lechem hapanim that was put inside the Beit HaMikdash, that's where they would make it. That was different, right? A completely different place than the people who made the chavitin for the Kohen, for the Chavit Kohen. Mizrachit tzvoni, northeast, ba ganzu b'nei Hashmonai et adnei hamizbeach sheshiktsum malchei Yavan. That's where the sons of the Hashmonaim had hidden away the stones from the altar that had been defiled by the kings of Greece, right? By the Hellenists. Sfonit Ma'aravit, the northwest Lishka, Ba Yordim LeBeit HaTvila. That's where they would go down to the mikveh that we mentioned earlier, that if somebody found that they were tamei, they would go through that lishka down underneath the mikdash to go to the mikveh. Right? We referenced that in an earlier shiur. So, just to round this off. Oh, actually, wait a second. I had another picture to show you. Yeah, I thought you might be interested. Yeah. This was I copied this from the Perush Mishnayot of the Rambam, right? So I brought one of these before. This is the sketch the Rambam made, and he made a bunch of sketches in Masechet Midot to illustrate what he used to illustrate the Mishnah that we just learned, and it's rather crude scale, but it's it's a good illustration. Let's blow it up a little. So this area here is the Lishkat HaGazit, and I don't have my pointers. Just a second. All right, we'll do it without pointers. Try to look at my cursor. Right, so again, just to give us the directions, right? So the right side of the page is north, the left side is going to be south, the top is west, and the bottom is east. These are the lishakot that were just mentioned in the Mishnah. So Lishkat Tlaim over here, this is in the northwest. It's in the relative Beit HaMoked, it's the southwest. It's the southwest. This whole area of the Beit HaMoked is on the north side of the Beit HaMikdash. And then within that block, we have Lishkat Tlaim, which is the southwest. We have opposite it Lishkat Oseh Lechem HaPanim. That's where, right, in the south, in the southeast is where they made the Lechem. Where he has in the Beit HaMoked, so this is where the Kesifin would be. This would be where there would be some kind of a physical divider that was coming down from the beams of the ceiling. There would be something that came down to show you that now you're going from Chol, which would be here to the north. This part here would be to the north. That part was Chol. And the part that's to the south, that would be Kadosh. And then we have the northeast part, that's where they hid the Avnei Mizbach. And then the northwest part, that's where they would go down to the Beit HaTvilah. And something I mentioned earlier, which I told you I wasn't sure about, it's hard to tell from the Mishnayot that we saw, if the person who goes down to the Beit HaTvilah, if the fire there, in addition to the fire that was in Beit HaMoked, or it was just that there was a fire in the Beit HaMoked. And the Rambam says here in the Perush Mishnayot that he would come up from the Beit HaTvilah and sit next to a fire that was in the Beit HaMoked. Just to clarify that. Okay, so that's the Lishkat HaTlaim. That's there where they.
Yeah. Sorry, a question. What does you assume? What is the function or the meaning of the chamber of the for the Avnei Hamizbeach displaced by the Greek? So from the destruction of, or no, with Hanukkah. So what is its function? Like an askara, or like the broken table, or the pot? Or so.
You know what?
Because
I'll try.
in the area,
Yeah.
in the area not kadosh, it's in the hall, in the profane, in the not in the area the hall. So what do you assume? What do you know about? I never heard. So first, yesterday I studied, and so I was a little bit surprised about Avnei Bear.
I didn't prepare that this time. There is a little bit more to be said about it, but basically just to think of it like that, the Avnei Mizbeach were defiled at the time when the Hellenists had taken over because they had been used for Avodah Zarah. And so they just be discarded because they had originally had a Kedusha. So, they were put into Geniza, right? And so what's the purpose of Geniza? Like when we talk about Geniza for Sfari, what do we mean when we say we put a sefer into Geniza? What's the purpose of putting a sefer into Geniza? It's to keep it from public circulation. That's the basic idea of Geniza. Geniza is to take something away from public circulation that you're not allowed to destroy. So the Avnei Mizbeach had that same status. You're not allowed to destroy them. It should just be discarded. And on the other hand, you can't use them for the Mizbeach. So the only option is to put them into Geniza. So they made a special place. Now, why was it particularly there? I don't have an immediate answer for that. In fact, I was thinking about it when I was preparing this, if I should go into it, because I've learned it before, and I think more along the way I found a little bit more about it. So b'li neder, I'll bring something more for next time. But that's the basic idea, and they were put into Geniza. They had to be kept somewhere, so they kept them with confines of the Beit HaMikdash writ large, but not in the holy part of the Beit HaMikdash, right? They were kept in a part that was chol. So that, there are other references to, in the construction of the Beit HaMikdash that also are reminders of the time when the Hellenists had defiled the Beit HaMikdash. And eventually, as we learn more and more about the geography of the Beit HaMikdash, we'll come to them. There's another part over here in the south that's a reference to it, and so forth. So those reminders were kept there. So what I'll say is it's a good question, and I'll try to bring a little bit more next time. So let's go back to the Mishnah. So here we are, Amar Lahem. So he said to them, Su'u v'aviu talem milishkat atlaim. So now we know when. They went to the Lishkat HaTlaim. They would pull a sheep out. V'harei Lishkat HaTlaim hayta b'miktzot tzfonit ma'aravit. The Lishkat HaTlaim was in the northwest corner. So if you remember, I'll just point out, in Midot, it says it's Maravit Dromit. It says it's in the northwest corner. And over here, it's in the northwest corner. So the Gemara says it was dependent on which point of view you were at. Is it relative to what? Is it northwest or southwest? So it was understood that so if you're looking from the north, then it would be in the east, and if you're looking from the south, it would be in the northwest. And it was north relative to the whole Beit HaMikdash. But the Gemara concludes that there isn't a machloket. It's actually a sugya in Masechet Yoma, but I chose not to go through that sugya, although we may go back to it because it does get into some of the details of the layout of the Beit HaMikdash. Okay. So now we have the parallel here to the Mishnah that we saw in Midot, Rabban L'Shakot Yusham. This is not the same Mishnah, but Tamid too. Excuse me. So Arba L'Shakot Yusham. There were 4 L'Shakot in that part of the Beit HaMikdash. Excuse me. Achad Lishkat HaTlaim. One was Lishkat HaTlaim that we described. Achad Lishkat HaChotamot. One was the Lishka of seals. The Achad Lishkat Beit HaMoked. One was Lishkat Beit HaMoked. The Achad Lishkat Shayu Osim Ba Lechem HaPanim. One of them was the Lishka where they made the Lechem HaPanim. So this is described differently here than the way we saw in Midot. So let's look through the Bar Tunura and explain these different things. Lishkat HaChotamot. So what was Lishkat HaChotamot? Shalokchei solet l'mincha yain l'nesachim. This was a place that people who purchased the flour for a korban mincha or wine for libations, they needed to go to the Lishkat HaChotamot. And he's going to explain, and I'll show you this also in the Mishnah. So let's say you had to buy solet for a mincha or wine for a nesachim. So what you would do is you would go to the administrator, the person who was appointed to take charge of seals. He would give him money enough to purchase the libations, let's say the wine, that he would need. He would give him a seal. The seal was like a petek, but in other words, it was a physical thing that he gave him. Basically, it was proof of purchase. The seals were proofs of purchase. Then he would take the seal, he'd go to the person who actually was appointed to hand out the nesachim. That's the way it worked. You would go, you'd pay your money basically at a kupa. The kupa, I actually shouldn't use the word kupa because kupa had a specific meaning also in the Beit HaMikdash. But in modern terms, we'd say it's like you went to the to the pay station. Like you go to pay for the whatever it was you were going to get, and that person your money, and he would give you a chotam that would prove that you paid, and then you'd walk to a different part of the Beit HaMikdash to get your goods, right? To get the nesachim in this case. Yotan lishka shehamimuna al hachotamot yoshev ba hi kruya lishkat hachotamot. Right? The place where he actually sat, that was called Lishkat HaChotamot. The Masechet Shkalim Meforash Chotam yu b'mikdash. Masechlim. We'll take a quick glance at Masechet Shkalim in a second, just to reinforce this. There it explains that there were 4 chotamot. So if you went to buy something, you could buy 4 things. This is according to the Tanna Kama. There's a machloket. Maybe there's a 5th one, but we'll go with this. The Katuv Alehem, each chotam had a word on it. One would say egel, one would say zachar, one would say gdi, and one would say chotem. So the egel, right, a calf, if you got one that was stamped with calf, yadush natan ma'ot l'niskei par. So meant that you bought the libations, wine for the nesachim, for when the offering was going to be a bull. Zachar yadush natan ma'ot l'niskei ayu. If it said Zachar, that meant that you bought Nesachim for a ram. Saw earlier, elsewhere, Shetagum Dichra in Aramaic, right? And the Dalet and the Zion are mitzvot, right? They exchange. Dichra is like Zichra, it's like Zachar, and that means Ayil. Gedi, if you got a chotam that had written on it a kid, yadu shantan ma'ot l'niskei kebes. That meant that you had you bought the libations for a lamb. Choteh, if it was marked choteh, yadu shantan ma'ot l'niskei mitzorah. You were buying the libations that a mitzorah would have to bring along with his korbanot. And then explains Lishkat Beit HaMoked. It was called Lishkat Beit HaMoked al Shem HaMidurash Utoleket Bat Tamid because there was always a fire that was burning there. Kuya Beit HaMoked. It was called the house of the flame, right? The house of the fire. So, just to show you, and again, if you want to follow up yourselves, you can look in the Mishnah Shkalim. We're kind of jumping around because there are these various places in Shas that tell us about the goings on in the Beit HaMikdash. And right now, as you know, we're focusing on Tamid to give us a better general view. Occasionally, we look at Midot to get a better geographic understanding. And in Shkalim, it also tells us a lot of the way, a lot of the administrative aspects of the way things function in the Beit HaMikdash. And of course, Shkalim, it's centered on the idea of taking the machatzita shekel and bringing it to the Beit HaMikdash. And then how did that money where did that physically go? And then how was it used in running the Beit HaMikdash? This is part of that discussion. And this is in the 5th chapter. I have here Perek Hey Mishnah Gimel. If you want, I'm not going to do this now, but it's just interesting to see from the beginning of this chapter. It tells us the names of people who had these jobs. And then the one who's mentioned is Yochanan ben Pinchas al hachotamot, and then Acha al hanisachim. Right, so and then while we're here, Matityahu ben Shmuel al hapaisot. Right, so these were all administrators who had their part in taking care of the daily functioning of the Beit HaMikdash. And now we're going to when we skip down further to Mishnah Gimel, it tells us now about the function of the Mimunah Chotamot. And here, this is the part that the Bartanur is referencing. Arba'a Chotamot hayu b'mikdash. V'katuv aleihen egel zachar gedi choteh. Ben Azai omer chamisha hayu, v'aramid katuv aleihem. So Ben Azai said, first of all, actually there were 5. And the Chotamot were not written in Hebrew, they were actually written in Aramaic, because Aramaic was the more common, that was the Franca, that was the commonly spoken language. But they indicated Egel, Zachar, Gadi, and then Choted Dal, a poor Choted, in other words, a Metzorah who didn't have enough money to bring a grander version of the korbanot that a Metzorah had to bring. And the Choted Ashir, somebody who was rich enough, he would bring all 3 behemot that would be part of the korban of the Metzorah. And then it explains, Ego Meshemeshim Niskei Bakar, Gdolim Ktanim. The egel would be used for the purchase of Nesachim for Bakar, right, for cattle, both big and small. Scharim in the Kevot, whether big or small, whether male or female. Gedi, Meshemeshim Niskei Tzon, Gdolim Ktanim, Scharim in the Kevot. If you bought for Nesachim for any korbanot, for any korbanot son, whether big or small, in other words, older or younger is what it's referring to, older or younger son on the korban, and whether they were male or female. Chutz Mishal, Chutz Mishal Elim, right? So because you could say Elim, that rams were part of Tzon, but Tzon but Elim had their own. Zachar Meshemeshim Niskei Elim Bilvad. Zachar was the chotam that was used for Niskei Elim alone. Chotam Meshemesh Niskei Shalosh Behemot Shamitzoraim. Right, the 3 animals that Mitzorah would have to bring when he came to do his korbanot.